Cause I die before I'll ever be a slave again.
It's like, you know, we all got to be on the same page if we're going to make it.
I'm like, oh, picnicking and meetings. Maybe it's a desert island and they're drinking out of coconuts. I don't know. Are they pirates?
And that kind of longing for that connection never leaves us.
We want to get to the emotional bottom of those interactions that feel so heightened that they become weird and almost baffling. This one's very personal because I made this one.
Hi, I'm Gus from Yes We Cannibal. Welcome to this week's edition of Beat Meat.
I am Liz Lessner, one half of Yes We Cannibal, one of the co-founders of Yes We Cannibal, along with Matt Keel. We want to welcome you to our Sunday Salon series. We are a space for experimental production in the areas of art, food, music, culture, and our Sunday Salon series provides a place to talk to authors, poets, musicians, and artists about their work. This week, we are so lucky to be joined by Will Alexander, and I'll introduce him shortly. But just to share a few upcoming things with you, we have an artist in residence coming into town this Monday named Erin Woodbury, and her show will be opening May 15th. And next Sunday, 2 Sundays from today, on May 22nd, we have anthropologist and filmmaker Elizabeth Pavanelli joining us for a Sunday Salon, another Meet. But today, we are so lucky to be joined by Will Alexander. Will Alexander works in multiple genres. In addition to being a poet, he's a novelist, an essayist, an aphorist, a playwright, a philosopher, a visual artist, and a pianist. His influences range from poetic practitioners such as Aimé Césaire, Bob Kaufman, André Breton, Antonin Artaud, and Philip Lamantia, to the encompassing paradigm of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga and the Egyptian worldview as understood by Sheikh Anta Diab and R.A. Schwaller de Lubeck's. Sorry if I butchered that, Will. Will first came to our attention through a book of short prose that he wrote called, I don't know if you can see that, A Cannibal Explains Himself to Himself. So of course, we at Yes We Cannibal, we're very interested in talking to Will. I've also got here 2 of his later books, Kaleidoscopic Omniscience and Refractive Africa, which Will tell us a bit more of and hopefully read a little bit of for us. So thank you so much for joining us, Will. Please help me fill in any gaps that are going to be pertinent to today's conversation.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Thank you so much. You got a lot of it, most of it, and we're here not to. I'm not here to just pontificate the past, but to open the future. And I'll read a little bit from Refractive Africa. And the Refractive Africa has 2 versions. One is the one you showed, which is a from New Directions. And this is a British publication of the same book from Granta Publications in the UK. And I'll read a part of the Congo from the UK version, if that's okay. And we'll start here. Just we'll read about a portion of the opening part of the poem and go from there because it's a 50-page poem. And it'd be too much to just go into any kind of extended survey of the work. So I'm gonna do like about a small portion at the beginning, and we'll do our discussion from there, if that's fair, to give momentum. And I'll start reading. And this was done not automatically, but it was done automatically, but not out of any theory. I just wrote this naturally. And as I do most of my work, and there is study that goes into the work. It's like when you make a meal, you do have to put the salt and the other ingredients in there to prime it. You have to prime the meal. And then you prime that through your own reading and through your own, for poets, your own, I call it electrical research that prompts your inner core to language, via language. So I'll read the first few pages of the Congo, which is the center part of this book, the center pillar of this book, which also includes works on Jean-Joseph Robbie Ravello and of course Amos Tutuola. So I'll read part of the Congo. As a Kashik Sangoma, I peer into the Congo as transpersonal witness, as incisively faceted tiger, squirming, having the powers of a shark via forces that sculpt the lenticular as lightning, perhaps a telepathic wakefulness, perhaps magisterial conjuration, perhaps creating migrational litmus in my blood, thereby creating the dangerous template that is the Congo. Blood-infected, dazed conundrum, horrific with grandeur, solemnly lit by rainy episodes of lightning. Thus, duplicitous tragedy, innate with microcentric suffering, its stressful indictment, its tertiary woundings, its camps, its darkened glossolalia at the height of bloody moonrise. As far as auric markings, I am never plagued by microtessellation, by extended physical armament, as if under siege, listening to dysfunctional scallops. This being none other than spectral conflict consulted by looming sentiment, by the spectral inflame that allows the mind to consume itself as refraction, as a smoldering mental sea. Knowing resonance via Akashic transference, I spontaneously engage levitational fuels. Therefore, I engage magnetism and magically invade latitudes in formation by astonishment, by conundrum, by circuitous circulation, according to the realm of osmosis, non-aligned to the institutional as drama. Via intuition, I leap to China and its pragmatic repression, its sociological deprecation. Therefore, I take issue with pragmatic epistles. Mechanical as they are with superimposed stasis, conveyed as pointless equilibrium, always desirous of burning roads into swamps, placing taxable recognition on grain, or pulling wayward crops from earth. These are measures that suffocate the Congo with its intricate mysteriums, so that we cultivate endemic demise, so that we cultivate infected tautology, that bruise us ventriloquial diamonds, shattered in such a manner that we become studded with foreign domination that degrades, according to Waddick from Belgium, or entangled castles in Britain, or psychic swamps in the Vatican. And all of the above sire general psychic clotting, siring a nightmare of particulars, negatively alive with carnivorous anti-resistance, a resistance that reigns as compromised respiration, alive as the global Occident with its self-defaunation as fever, with its thought always active as befouled arrangement to percussive ostentation, as poison psychic fuel, as manufactured habitats, as emblematic dysfunction. The Occident searching for hallowed animal function, for the poisonous protraction as facade that has left us exhausted, enfeebled, burning with quantum negation, with the resurrected, gifted, grafted to negation of ourselves. When the Belgians told us we were purposeless, we believed. When Christian nuns struck crosses across our brow, we believed. We believed that part of our galaxy was centered in Liège, in the Place Vendôme, and concentrated fumes gathered from London's iconic bridge. Thus, our psychophysical wattage reduced to phantom galling, to palpitating candles, to broken cellular infernos. Thus we exist as phantom cobalt and tin, as blind psychic enumeration that issue from itinerant conundrums, creating in our minds complex physical scale, thereby creating Earth's archaeology, wayward Christian voids, being none other than spreading micro-infection that attempts at weakening the stability of the soul, this being attempted annihilation, exponential as expanded annihilation that parallels the triple component of the body, mind, and spirit. As a Akashic freedman, I'm able to peer through and beyond the pitch of European corrosion and its attendant psychic confusion that occludes itself via the pole of matter, via the dialectic that begins to feign itself through properties that events mechanism as upgrade so that it kills and scatters all indigenous subtext. In order for indigenous power to ascend beyond abstruse delimitation, we must decipher printed reams concerning the post-colonial dossiers on Christ. This meaning are charged psychic vicinity, co-woven with implanted prevarication, with its slaughtered spinning and verbs, not unlike Moish Shombe and the Kabilas, having sired and kept alive tenacious psychophysical noise as racket, as modular drones sent to root out our secrets, all the while concocting a sun that descends and rises on obverse slaughter fields, where nausea perfects its phantoms on earth, where all of our corpses are publicly conveyed, crowned by a garland of lizards wrapped around our skulls, not like anemones awash amidst scorpions, Europeans seeing us less higher than our tortured calls issuing from the mouths of lions. I'll stop at this particular time on that portion, but we'll go further if need be. And just wanted to say a couple words about the energy in this book. It is part of a wave of a series of books that I've been involved in over, I'd say, putting out within the last, it's been an enormous amount of work in the last 2 years. And this is one of the books that's been accomplished during this period of time. Say honestly, in terms of actual writing from the 2020, but I've been busy with a lot of different works and putting out a lot of different projects, and Refractive Africa is one of them. And first, as I wrote the book, the natural architecture became apparent to me of individual centerpiece, the individual as periphery, and the centerpiece that was the Congo. Because I wanted to go, and as I said in the essay that introduces the book, we're talking about a domination that's transpired since, I'd say a little prior to Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal. And his father, King John I, invaded Morocco, because this is fairly close. And having been in Portugal, I know that it's in the vicinity. So at that time, King John, his father, John I, came into Ceuta. It's a city that's still in Morocco, and began the first efforts of colonization. We're talking in the I'd say the 1360s, a little further up within that vicinity. And then his son, Prince Henry the Navigator, began to filter down the west coast of Africa. So we're talking about a time scale that's enormous in terms of human effort. We're talking about, 700 years or so, if my dates are correct. In terms of the 700 years, it's going to be from, I'd say, the mid 1360s to the present day. And that's a long time for human beings to suffer psychologically, physically, and psychologically from invasion. And it's been a protracted, nonstop assault on the psychology of the inhabitants. So, not to drag this into the present in a certain way, but a political way, but there's such a contrast between how the plight of the Ukrainians are treated, as bad as it is. It is an unfortunate situation that's going on in the Ukraine right now. But the protracted carnage in the Congo that it's never really reported on. You may get some information on it via the BBC or other outlets, but not in terms of any kind of protracted or sustained conveyance of the suffering that's transpiring. Yet at the same time, all of our essential contact points in terms of technology are mined from that particular region. And you can talk about anything from timber to the cell phone usage in the tantalum, things like that. The situation with even things like golf clubs and things like obviously automobiles. But we never are given the region of where these substances have come from. Yet at the same time, we understand that, I understand this to be, and others understand this to be an incredible disparity between the wealth that happens in a place like Bern or in parts of Switzerland, and the average GDP of somebody like in the Congo or Niger, or in that particular region of where the actual sources come from and the labor comes from, where the GDP of the of the family in the Congo is around between the $900 level. Where if you go to north into Switzerland, you find that same kind of numbers package escalated to over $100,000. So this is the backdrop I understand as part of the circumstance on planet Earth and for a protracted amount of time. But this is why I wanted to poetically go into the region, because we're talking about human balance, not chronic balance, but human balance. As we live as particular beings in a cosmos, we cannot. There's no way we can understand the dimension about the cosmos, no matter how many technological advancements we've procured in the past 100 years. So,
Will, you write about the...
Can I hear you?
You write about the electrical current that language can generate, and is there a way in which you see refractive Africa as a kind of a spark that's meant to redress some of that energy?
Yeah, I'm redressing it lingually, not as obviously not as a political person. It's none of that. It's about this inherent electricity in language that I'm conveying, and that's I won't embellish it further than that. But that's the source that I'm working with.
Well, can you say maybe a little bit more about that for people who are not as familiar with your writings about the transmutational power of language? There's definitely a way. Your prose is unlike anything I've ever read before. And so there's certainly a way in which your prose engages an energy that isn't available in other medias, or other uses.
Well, I'm understanding language as an electrical spark and as a mechanism of conveyance rather than any kind of didacticism. But each word has a certain kind of a level that you can contract or expand it. And for poets, you can take this as expansion and run it beyond, cognitive, what we call what's called cognitive limit, where the word can morph and take on other aspects of itself that like meta aspects of itself. And these meta aspects can more ardently commingle with other meta aspects of language, so that the whole text begins to morph into another equilibrium. So that's what I'm working with at this time.
Yeah, I can feel it. Maybe you'd like to read a little bit more?
Okay, well, we can try this out. Okay. I'll get the right one of the right pages here. Or I'll just start at any place that we were working with. But here we go. I'll read further from the Congo, and we'll try it out from that point. Okay, I'll start on a random page. As for Europe, it equates suffering with destiny. And so suffering for them remains holiness. And according to this calculus, the Congolese are holy. So for them, the rashes, the scorpion marks, the machetes and dismemberment remain reasonable, remain none other than authority by God. The God of Antwerp knows that balances blaze at the juncture between the living and the living dead. And between the living and the living dead, prophets of Kuru, and the Congo left as dark, emotional inferno, as compound, interchangeable inferno. All the while, the living dead harangue existence, and from this haranguing, a grammar emerges, both vertigo and scarab. Via this oral context, the Dutch attempt to camouflage themselves with crosses, while the Belgians attempt to beautify their ulcers, having broached the glossary that corrodes itself beyond the dignity of grace. Perhaps I am an osmotic conjurer, suddenly erupted from Dahomey, kindled by mountainous ciphers, by a current only ghost can withstand, alive with aleatoric electrification that spikes the auspices of all suns, being their anterior auto-causality, not unlike the initial causality of diamonds. This state anterior to the nano-causality of current, yet there exists respiration as transparency, possessing energy that hatchlings are consumed by, perhaps a gust of power beyond human selectivity as carbon, beyond ghostly burins that burn beneath the basin that is the Congo. And the Congo, anti-ecumenical as alphabetic marking form, parallel as sabotage to Teutonic cadastral concerns, just this side of the visible, just this side of occidental clamps and mazes. This is not the Congo entrapped by tantalum or diamonds or capital that issues from tainted human bloodware. This being insight This being the Congo as transpersonal equator, as amplified osmosis, as that which minds itself as trans-Uranian verdict. And this verdict never partaking of literal coloration, but cast in the power that our ancestors continuously acknowledged, being an energy that bends and overcomes blinding and gives over to states that contradict the very essence of waste and overconsumption. Of course, the Congo is squandered marker as gerrymandered dictation. Having peered through quotidian evidence, assessing the garrulous conjoined to cultivated evil as northern institutional doctrine threaded by ominous elliptical jaundice. As Sankoma, at times my thoughts remain invaded by lepers designed by bottomless kindling, by seeming negation with their agglutinated judgment, always claiming that African integument is scrawled and substandard, that it suffuses, that it remains suffused with leprous debility, with blazeless insomnia, as if the African body were none other than repulsion, as if it were not unlike primal glass burning with slippage and mange, assaultive, surreptitious with risk, and oblivious with sulfur, alive with wayward ptomaine and ether. This remains a susurration of the Occident as it mines our tantalium, as it extracts mazes of tin and timber, as it maniacally bathes beneath a waterfall of diamonds. This ignites suffering made manifest as cliche, and this suffering remains our hidden planetary equation. And so, as Sangoma, as architect of levels never seen, I must remain still in order to brew pharaoh medicine as revenge, as if I were a blinded potter, igniting infernal design cast upon the ruthlessness of the Belgians, upon the French who protract our despair via the sadism of northern riches, via mismanaged proxies who breathe as traitors, who inflict with their methods perpetual murder and betrayal. I'll stop there. It'll just keep going on.
Can I ask who is the subject in Refractive Africa? Who's the speaker and from what vantage point?
He's an African healer.
Okay. The other thing I noticed from looking through Cannibal, Cannibal explains himself to himself, is, you know, the metaphor of plague and contagion that sort of seems to prefigure our current COVID crisis that kind of runs through so much of your writing when you write about the transmutive power of language and the electrical connection of language.
Well, it creates heat. I'm trying to get this psychic heat into the text. That way there's a kind of a warmth that pervades the language as I conduct myself through these instances of these instances of history. You know, the whole idea of the plague was diagnosed by this Muslim physician in the 1000s. His name was Ibn Khatib, who talked about the beginning of the plague in whenever 1300s. He said the plague was basically due to a lack of hygiene, and that it became a collective reality to the large populations in Europe and in those years. That I think Barbara Tuchman years ago talked about the behavior under the plague, you know, in these societies, European societies in the 1400s. But all that aside, I'm talking about a situation of healing via the sonic sounds. And I was just listening to this sound that was recorded. It came out of a black hole about 2 days ago. It's amazing. It's very interesting, very eerie, but there is sound. And there's sound in the universe that we can't hear. And the realities that we can't see or touch or smell. You know, one of these things, like Africa, you don't ever hear or see or touch or smell that in reality in any of our resources in the media. I mean, there are some alternative sources, but Africa never comes through. So when somebody takes a golf club out, he doesn't know where it comes from. I'm not expecting everybody to be a researcher or a scholar, but I'm just saying you should know that there was a source for some of this activity. And for this particular activity, you know, that there was a source of the people, there was a source of the land, and it was a source of the labor that has never been properly addressed. And we see this all the time. If you turn on any of these major channels of whatever, the ABC or Fox or NBC, you never really hear anything about any of our source materials that we depend on for daily life, and how that's affecting the people at the source of this largesse that we are fortunate to have at this time. We don't understand how the whole planet is affected, and this particular part of the planet is affected. It's a whole long address one can get into in terms of balance, not in terms of politics, but in terms of balance. We have to understand balance, because the reason why it says balance and talk about this time, because we are facing not just a generational shift, but a fantastic shift of climate and weather that's unprecedented. And the cosmos is not on a date schedule about, so you're asking a kid, how old are you today? How old are you? Are you 105? Or I just read a story about a 100-year-old person running a marathon at the Penn Central Relay. But that's our situation of age and understanding in this universe that we live in. But the cosmos has no idea, we just extract this understanding, but we're talking about light years. We're talking about this planet, no, this galaxy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Alcyonus, that takes you 16.3 light years to cross. We don't.
Will, did you hear about this idea that there's a parallel universe where time is running backwards, starting from the Big Bang?
Yeah. We don't know anything about these things, and we do, but we don't. We're speculating, and it's already here for us. But when we talk about discovering something, we're dealing with something that's already been with us all along. When Hubble, talked about the separate island universes, what does that mean? Since they were already there. I'm not taking anything away from Hubble, but we're behind. And so the indigenous systems tend to intuit these things. And I think that the astronomy and these mythologies are coming into a kind of meeting realm at this time. One of the old astronomers, his name recently old, but Alan Sandage talked about biogeopoetry. That the merging, these distances are merging into the poetic.
Can you say more about that? Because there's a real current in your work that's all about the surface and topology, and I know that you're also a painter, so that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about was surfaces and how that relates to language.
Yeah, because a word will have energies that are visible, all visible, but at the same time occulted at the same time, and you have textures and movements of land, and soil, and certain places you can grow grapes, other places you grow other kind of crops. It depends. In other words, it has all these rhythmical nuances to it within a single word, and that depends upon your hearing, the texture of your hearing, the sensitivity of listening. Because something that I think it was Breton and William Blake talked about, the power of hearing, not the power of seeing. We live in an optical culture, so to really hear, you can get into what poetry is about, not how it looks, but how the ear registers it, how the poet registers the sensitivity to hearing, which is really an indigenous trait that had not been explored properly, and as far as I can see.
So is that at odds with optics, with refraction? Can we ever really hear Africa? Can we only see these kind of particles?
No, we do see, we do hear. It's a full spectrum of the senses, but to hear the situation, you get into the actual contact point, and then it grows into the optical. In other words, the optical is a secondary understanding that grows out of the oral, out of the hearing.
And so one thing I've been prompted to ask you about is your relationship to surrealism, because I know you're often described as a surrealist. But I would love to hear your take on that. And I know you cite Breton as a major impact.
Yeah, I respect the whole situation with surrealism, but as Cesare put it, we're indigenous listeners. And, not to harp on Frida Kahlo, Frida Kahlo once said that the Mexican landscape was already indigenous. That was already surrealist prior to Breton's arrival. So in other words, we're trying to create a living mix of understanding, by all these elements, to not just segregate things out and say it's French, or it's only in Belgium, and it's only in Switzerland, or it's only by this particular person or that particular person. But energies overlap, reality overlaps into all these transcendent activities. And it's not one thing. That's what we've come to understand right now. We're in this land of new discovery at the present time. So that's what I'm working with now, is this energy of new discovery, and maybe I'm crossing heretical boundaries, but so be it. This is the 21st century.
I actually have this great quote pulled out from you on exactly this topic. The verbal energy whose appellation is surrealism remains ubiquitous, not unlike water or the surrounding circumstance, which is the sky. It's not the province of any particular geography or language. It cannot be defined via academic cul-de-sac. A natural environment cannot be consumed by ideology and doctrine. It remains a dark, eruptive sea that never codifies or.
That's true. I mean, you can't confine it to France, although there was a lot of activity in 1929, but this is not 1929. And we find somebody like Bob Kaufman, you have this incredible confluence of power that was written in the English language in 1959, 1963. So now we're talking about a spirit of consciousness. Although maybe certain kinds of languages express themselves in more fluent ways via this understanding, but I'll have to admit it's the conduit of the individual as he or she grasps a wider space of of I'll call it equilibrium.
I know that you strongly identify as a Los Angeles poet, and I'm wondering if there are examples of naturally occurring surrealism in Los Angeles you care to point us to.
Well, I grew up in the southern region of the city, in what's now infamously known as South Central Los Angeles, where when I was 7 years old, my mother, my late mother, saved one of my schoolmates from being hung from a tree.
That must have made quite the impression on you. And how did she do that?
She had an authority, and she had a certain kind of a, I would say not a swagger, but she had this energy that was able to understand the circumstance and size it up and speak in the moment. And it was amazing. It was amazing. I'll never forget it. My friend was named, I'll never forget the gentleman's name. He was a little 7-year-old named Gregory. I never known his last name, but we're just 7 years old, and this is what the province dictated. So that was surrealism right there, and I didn't even know it.
So you've been operating under the surrealist imagery since you were 7 years old.
Oh, probably before that. It was something inside of my system that was attracted to the otherworldly. I know some children see spirits. You know, you're at that age where your mind's fresh and your system's fresh. And I did encounter an energy that seemed to be not real at that time, during that period. And it's always stayed with me. In fact, I've written about it in one of my books, my first City Lights book. I can't think of the title right now, but it's in there. It was a piece on anti-biography. I think is the name of it.
What exactly is anti-biography?
Well, you're not thinking of your biography as it's just a linear field, but as a total field. And so I have an anti-linear thinking pattern that didn't go over very well in my so-called educational career, but still, it's still with me.
How does that, I mean, the theme, the metaphor of electricity is so strong in all of the writings of yours that I have read. And in Refractive Africa in particular, you're making this incredible link, not just with electricity as a metaphor, but with electricity and colonialism. And do you see this kind of nonlinear pattern? Do you see electrons as a better way of thinking through this idea of nonlinear thinking, of dispersion and magnetism and connection?
Well, it's a cosmic force. Being a cosmic force, it works in terms of absolute connection and conductivity. Sri Aurobindo calls it knowledge by identity. And this is just getting into the core movement of the language, not using like buffers like you find in articles in language, like ands and a's and thus, but you get straight to the current of the word itself. And the conducting points are like in the language, not in the articles. Although you need the articles to help articulate or do some architecture in terms of the phrase or the sentence, but you want to get to the electricity of the actual movement there that has nothing to do with the particular situation as such, but how it conveys the language of the situation. So that's how you get to move other energies, be it people or just sound. How persons in parts of the world can mesmerize cobras. So we're talking about mesmerization of energy, and these sounds coming out of the cosmos prove it.
Can you describe the sound of the black hole to us?
It was very, very eerie. Very eerie and very, had an ominous feeling to it. But I've been told that they've been measuring certain context of sounds coming from the cosmos that sound like the general signature of I think it was the B flat with the blues sound. And these are natural forces. My theory is that the natural mathematics comes from what we receive, not from what we create for our consumption. We give it all these titles. In other words, our raw energy comes from like the Congo, or like it comes from the cosmos. I'm not saying that it's an exclusive situation, but that's how sound and reality emanates from that which is already there. Because I'm just taking it not as an expert, but just a general situation. What's a million years ago, or 3 million years ago, 10 million years ago? Say within this 10 million years, the human race evolved from Eastern Africa. And that's how we become knowledgeable of what this is. We're subsequent beings. We're not just like controlling beings. And so this control in Africa is a manufactured one, and a physical one, but a manufactured one that took place with colonization. And I'm not talking about recently, but we're talking about, the Romans got there in 47 BC and introduced certain kinds of forms of control. The Greeks didn't get there to 332 BC. So in other words, the indigenous praxis of pyramidal building was totally an African construct. That's what it's good to say that, not as an ideological point of view, but the fact it opens up minds on this planet that's so obscured by, who won the game last night. And I'm not, and I love, I just looking at the Boston Bruins and the other, and the Phoenix Suns. People play basketball, and I'm a person that loves sports, but it's too much emphasis on short-term activity. Who won last night? But what about who you are? Where did you come from?
Well, how did you cultivate your practice of listening? I mean, I think that's something that I'm interested in for sure. And, with my students, I do these Pauline Oliveros exercises. Mm-hmm. Do you have any particular poetic reference points for your practice of listening?
Well, it's something that comes out of me, but I would say primarily it's an interesting situation where I was able to be awakened to this quality in myself through listening to people like Pauline Oliveros and Eric Dolphy, John Coltrane. You put all that together, Pierre Nurgor, people who may not even know these names, but these are things that my ear is naturally attracted to, putting certain combinations of balances together. And I didn't know I was doing that when I was first listening to these things. But here, this is the fruition of it at this time.
I'm just getting a prompt here to ask you a little bit about, we're in Baton Rouge, and so we know that you are very Los Angeles based, but you've also told us that you have Southern roots here. Does that filter into your work at all, or?
I'd never really been a regional writer. I have family that was born in that area, but myself, I've been here in Los Angeles. And but that's not structured my hearing. Never has structured my hearing. So my hearing is coming from a wider, much wider range than the regional area. It's kind of like Nikolai Gogol once said. They said that Nikolai Gogol didn't travel, but he heard. He could listen. And so to listen allows a very much wider scope than what somebody does with gumbo. Not that I'm knocking gumbo, but in other words, you're not cornered in by your local condition.
Well, what about blues? Blues and jazz?
Blues and jazz come from there, yeah. But the sound I'm listening to is something that there's a scholar named, what's his name? I think Ali was his last, Ali, but he talked about, what did he talk about? He talked about the sound, this interesting sound coming out of the North African continent that John Coltrane picked up on. For instance, John Coltrane had never gone to Africa, but this is magnificent recording of Africa that everybody should know about and listen to get into some kind of transmutation. Because I'll say this, it's difficult to get into some kind of trance via what's known as popular music. But in indigenous cultures, what's popular is endemic to subconscious reason. I'll call it subconscious reason. But when you listen to Africa, you hear the spectacular conjoinings and flights in the sound. And people like Eric Dolphy was from Los Angeles, was interested in pygmy chants, or what they call pygmy chants. In other words, it's the growth of your inner ear, your listening praxis that allows you to develop at a certain level. It's not just an optical praxis of knowing this, knowing that, and putting all these things together, but how these sounds orchestrate themselves or compose themselves. If you ask Stravinsky something, he wouldn't be able to tell you how these things orchestrate themselves, although he understands the praxis of putting all these sounds into balance, different levels of balance, but you have to be able to first hear those things before you can orchestrate them.
It's just so interesting to hear you talk about that, because to me, the rhythm of your prose is so unlike anything else that I've ever read. So I can't identify any influences or precursors. And I think part of what first attracted us to you, you're talking about this kind of the roots of the indigenous and a sort of a different use of the sonic, a connection to the subconscious and the sonic. And I think part of what first attracted us to your work was this figure of the cannibal. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your interest in the figure of the cannibal.
Well, the cannibal, to me, a cannibal is something, it's not like in a pejorative sense, but it brings in energy. It takes one energy and brings it in as a positive, not as something that a person from Indonesia eats a European traveler. It's not like that. The cannibal is about ingestion of energy. And as you inspire this energy, I said cannibal explains himself to himself. Is that the name of the title? Well, as you explain yourself to yourself, you learn by actually writing, not by cognitive exercise from a third source, but from your own sources. You can begin to understand how that process works. And you have to trust it rather than to will it into being. But this is, I hope that makes sense.
We were very much inspired by the Anthropophagic Manifesto, Andrade's call to think of the Tupi Amerindians and their ritualist cannibal practices as a praxis against colonialism, as a way of kind of redefining yourself apart from colonization. So we were certainly drawn to the idea of the cannibal as someone, as a generative praxis, as a way of taking in all different sorts of elements, whether they be whether they have perhaps a negative connotation. I mean, one thing that appeals to me so much about your writing is the way you incorporate these sort of negative themes like plague and infection in a way that never feels cynical or poisonous. They get reincorporated, it feels like, in your writing. And I think that's something that appealed to us in choosing to name our organization after Andrade's Anthropophagic Manifesto.
Well, yeah, you're right, because of the fact that things can be transmuted. That's the alchemy. You know, you're transmuting these what's been labeled as pejorative, and you're transmuting these energies into a whole scale of another kind of understanding. Or what I call it a more vertical understanding or a more alchemical understanding, where you're not just taking one particle and just leaving it there and then transferring it to another particle and keeping everything separated and plugged in. But how do things meld together? How do things work as a total energy? I'm interested in total energies in that sense, not in segregated energies. So how do you take the right, they do that in medicine all the time. They'll take something from a plant, or, you know, and begin to give a small portion and mix it with others, and certain things become active in a positive manner inside the human body.
Well, COVID's shown us that, right? You can't cast anyone out. It's all enmeshed in the system. So you can't cast out the infected. You can't even keep them out of the country through travel bans. You can't.
All these things, yeah, you're right, absolutely right, because this is what's happening in spite of laws, in spite of the figmentation that's been projected upon us. We can only respond to life and balance, life as balanced. And if you have an idea about life as balance, you begin to understand this, you know, especially for a poet, you begin to understand how things come together rather than break apart.
Maybe that would be a great segue to ask you to read just a little bit more for us.
Okay. I'll take one more from the Congo. My power commingles with a relay of suns. So within the depth of this relay, one exists as circumstantial blankness that ceases to burn and react as old kindling. Never facet as lower conscription, I remain, not as sequestered banter, but as apogee, never enstamping myself with a dark or degraded coating, never functioning as if I were a myth wrought by delay that circumvents all higher reasoning. I understand the Congo to be a field without borders, but a circumstantial crafting replete with minerals and confusion. In this sense, it remains a state tautological with despair as blunted force, its fragmentation as primary element. This is how collective virtue subsists, when the ground is subject to alchemical alteration, where invisibility deepens, despite altered tendency that clings to the sadistic as expression. This is how my blaze is grown, of how my contradiction arises by revealing a colloquy of nerves, according to fundamental error, or according to assuring force and its plunge into grammar, into what I consider to be a roiling anemia that attempts to dominate through energy as isolation in order to transmute charisma into ungrateful seething. This is not hesitation that rallies to self-spawn itself according to protracted negation to contorted anatomy. It is through this contortion that my power magnetically sees via proto-animation that ignites and lurks as higher Uranian resolution, not as some messianic challenge that rise and condenses itself according to primeval flaw. Perhaps I remain divine rioting in the cells as psychic cleansing according to clarifying vapor, sans spiders that seem to reek of unclean webbing, sans grammar that deflates as motionless abomination. This is how private rage transmutes as scalar infernos, yet it is by this light that the Congo condenses itself, rising above its merciless addictions, above its rapes and abductions, above its marginalia through infanticide. I can go on, but we'll leave it at this point, that particular portion.
What role do you think rage can play today? I mean, we hear so much about rage and ineffectuality from a kind of mainstream media perspective. Mm-hmm. And that last little bit really, I'm just curious, what role you think rage can play in decoloniality today?
Well, I think Fenelon said it once about, the rage shouldn't be just acclimatized to feckless activity, but at the same time, it's got to be a combination of things. Mainly for me in terms of the internal, because it seems like, if, for instance, the Ukraine situation, the armies have run out of steam. In general, they're fighting wars that are protracted. They're protracted. How's the word going? They're retroactive. They're retroactive activity. It's not a it's not a movement that is conversant like in Afghanistan. It was a war that both the Soviets and the US had to pull out from because it was unconventional. It was nonlinear, and the mentality of the linear mind is going to be no longer conversant in times to come. It feels like that. We're on the verge of another reality. So in other words, to expand the mind into another scope. And I'm not talking here about the way that you're going to, vote next week, although that's something that's on their radar all the time. But how do you expand the mind? How does it grow into what it is? Rather than control it and turn it into a retarded factor. We want to get into the idea of opening rather than closing down and shutting down or diverting or say you're using politics and gerrymandering energy so that it comes out with a result when the energy that's being gerrymandered has not gone away. It's just been politically manipulated for that particular moment.
Well, you write about the way that our energy is squandered, and I think, someone who is important to me is Bernard Stiegler, who writes about the way that computational processes sort of, they cut off the potential of energy by sort of trying to map it out and correlate it, and thereby creating this huge database of correlation. They take away anything that feels productive about a new potential. And I guess I wonder, where you see the potential of language to be productive.
Well,
productive.
Yeah, language can be incredibly productive because we can go in different ways, but it's so many different ways, but it's been so commercialized and so put into provinces of itself, provinces into sub-provinces into sub-provinces. Thus you have your advertising climate. And a confusing one at that. because it's blunted, it doesn't lead you anywhere. This particular product is not going to do this or do that in itself, although it's projected to be that way. You know, this company says that you can drive this automobile, or you can buy this particular product for maybe cleaning this or doing that, and it'll make your life better, but not necessarily. And it hasn't. But we're talking about a whole community of this. They use disinformation or different clottings of the psyche. Whereas in indigenous cultures, in their original form, things began to flow. Things naturally flowed. There was not a difference between popularity and serious, so-called serious work. But there was a whole flow of energy through the celebrations and through the mourning and all of these things. In other words, it was life itself that was gathered into one whole scale with modifications along the way. But it's something here we've lost sense of the particular, in the sense that we don't understand how things definitely interchange with each other, but it's not always one thing.
Well, you know, and I'm borrowing this from Matt's research, who is in geography and anthropology, right? But there's this idea that the colonialists are jealous of indigenous ability to use language to affect the material world, to speak something into existence, and that so many of the negative and violent aspects stem from this sort of inability to use language to affect things in the material world.
Yeah, it does. There's no sensitivity to language, and you just take a blunt instrument and hit it. This is the way that there's, I think of this particular person, his name was a British art historian. I'll think of his name in a minute. And he wrote about this situation that you blunt the head of the axe or whatever, and you just be dumping on it and beat up people and take from them the things that you need without any kind of understanding about circulation. And we need to understand this concept of circulation again, where the whole languages begin to permeate the psychology of the population.
John Berger?
Not John Berger, no, I'm thinking of, he was a Cannibal. Not many people know him. Yeah.
Tell us more. I don't know him. I would love to know more.
Yeah, he wrote this book in the early 80s. Oh no, I found this book. Yeah, it was in the early 80s. He was art critic and a person from Britain who I'd never heard of before or since. But he wrote this situation about the psychology of colonization, about the way that art history was altered by the violence, in the psychic violence and military violence in Africa. And this is where, this is how Picasso was able to get Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, was from this understanding of Cubism from the African colonies, who, by the way, according to Bullard, let's see if I can remember his name properly. Cannibal talked about the first people to get some of the informational complexes that Picasso relied on were just the people in Europe didn't want them, because the military people took them out as part of the process. Whereas this guy, there's a gentleman from the Netherlands, Josh van Buren, I think that's his name. He wrote this book called Treasures in Trusted Hands, incredible book about the way that the UK took all the art and for the most part is reluctant to give any of that stuff back to the sources from which they took it. And this goes from Netherlands, it goes from France, Germany, Italy, you name it. The colonizing properties that came out of the Berlin Conference in 1885. But you see, nothing has changed in thousands, hundreds of years, thousands of years in human psyche, although we're superimposed by, new techniques of driving a car or washing a window. But it's still driving a car and washing a window.
I have to ask, and you can decline to answer, though I doubt that you will, but I'm curious what you think about the current debate around appropriation.
Well, the debate about the appropriation is it has to do with the financial template and the way that the World Bank and the situation has been manipulated. This gentleman named Yash Tandon wrote a book called Trade is War. And this trade is war is something that the African or indigenous populations around the globe are already suffering from. And we can see that with, in places like South India, for instance, or with the situation in parts of China with the Uyghurs. But it's not just simply just a political situation, but it's an energy situation on a wider scale, because we're right at the proto beginnings of that that confrontation. I wouldn't call it a confrontation, it's complication via the way the weather scales are tipping. But are we, we have to become, my idea is that we have to become conversant with ourselves enough so that we can bring this thing into some kind of balance, because attempt to bring this thing into some kind of balance, because, if you look at cosmic distances, we're absolutely isolated, in spite of what people tell you about going to Mars or terraforming Mars or going into, spaces like what Avi Loeb talks about, nanosailing, going to other galaxies. But we are not equipped psychophysically to deal with that. Maybe if we had have started a chain of energy transmission from the early Egyptians to the present time, or those studies that they deal with mummification and magic. But that's been eschewed and destroyed, and war has been, I don't want to get into a utopian construct here, but to say that say if a thread of that energy was translated with the Egyptians talking about what they talked about, the way it was employed, say in 10th century Granada, it would be an interesting world we'd be in right now. Very interesting.
Do you care to speculate on that? Because I know that you've written a book about like institutions of knowledge that have been destroyed and forgotten by, the Western Academy.
Well, for the most part, what I've done was write a book on this particular institution. It was named Dar el Hikmah, one of the systems of learning, energy complex of learning in Cairo, Egypt, that was founded in 1004 AD. But right now, it's been so occluded and so non-stressed. I thought I'd write a book about it and begin to learn certain things about the context of its implementation on Earth and how it's been forgotten, and the kind of mind that they had and the kind of mind that we were taught to employ at the present time. So the book is called On Dar el Hikmah, and I think it's due to come out from Africa World Press later in the year. But I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
And I know that you have several projects that are in various stages of completion. Would you care to tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and what's due to come out? Because I know there's so much.
Well, there's a lot of things. There's a book of essays coming out from Litmus Press in about another month or so. It's called The Coming Mental Range, and it'll be a large book of essays. And then there's also a book called The Dialogics I'm doing with Heller Levinson, who I've been working with him. He's a New York poet. And we're doing that. That's due to come out in actually a number of days. There also, and I'll put this up to the screen, this just came out about 2 days ago, called The Contortionist Whispers. It's from Notre Dame, from Action Books. And I'll hold it up there. So in other words, it's been very, very exhausting and at the same time, very productive. So that's just a few things.
Is that your painting on the cover?
Yeah, that's another thing I'm doing. This is a collaboration I've done with the painter Byron Baker. And we've done 3 trilogies of painting together, which we've had exhibited in Cairo, electrically exhibited in Cairo via the last Surrealist enclave that was conducted there in Cairo about 3 or 4 months ago. So it's going. It's so many things going on.
How does your painting practice intersect with your writing practice?
Oh, those things are like very conversant, because things, I always look at my painting is like holding up, feeling the balances in my left hand as opposed to my right hand, which is the writing. My left hand feels to be the counterbalance of the way that painting works, but in the same way, but it just has a different feel to it, but it works as all the arts worked for me in a confluent manner. And to deal with this confluency, one has to have very specifics about the painting process as opposed to the writing process, but basically they converge. And it's all about balances and how colors and shapes and things balance themselves and emerge as wholes, which is the way that galaxies work too. So once you employ these, or music, or the way that you put these things together, you understand how things actually shape themselves naturally. It's a combination of forces, but it's an alchemy to understand these things not as a separate force, but as a conjunctive reality.
Are your paintings semiotic systems?
Yes, they are. And I'm always aware of that. Yeah, exactly. Refractive Africa, there it is. And we're working on that all the time. And I say we're because it's more than one-minded work. Obviously, putting all these things together at one time, and you get an insight, and they begin to magnetize. The insight magnetizes everything and brings it into one whole, rather than dealing with separate parts. So I never deal with separate parts or cognitive analysis. This is something I got into trouble with as a student, because I was never good at separating things and putting things over there and putting things over here, and then creating a false dialectic.
Well, that gives us several points with which to wrap up. I don't know, maybe you'd care to speculate. One on, say, the resurgence of semiotics. Do you think that that's happening? Or 2 on the kind of state of the art of prose and poetry? Or 3 on your system of enmeshment and nonlinear understanding?
Well, I'll generate the last two parts you mentioned there. There was an interesting book some years ago that was composed by a very important book by Octavio Paz called The Bow and the Lyre. And in the opening pages, he talked about the enmeshment, if that word can be used in this context, of prose and poetry. and it had a sense of liberating my psychological system. Also, to understand how to put things together rather than take things apart. Because I think that now the mind is open to such a degree that it doesn't want to just separate disciplines, but put them together. It gives a liberty for the mind, where experts are no longer should be not the rigor. I think Thomas Kuhn in this theory of scientific revolutions talks about this syncretic factor of putting things together. He says the best, most fluid construction would be by non-experts. And I'm paraphrasing, the non-expertise, because the liberty of being a non-expert allows to put things, as Buckminster Fuller once says, to become a general comprehensivist. You know, we're talking about general comprehension. Now we're talking about not specific things. Well, I'm better than you, and this, but we all have to merge. And I'm trying to do all the merging together. When I do something like Refractive Africa, is to merge, not just African elements, but European elements and how they clash and how they move together and how they break apart. What's former, what's subsequent, and all these things. This was interesting about Grenada, which was syncretism that certain people flourished with, like people like Thomas Bacon, or or the ideas of Robert Grosseteste. But this is something that we wanted to pursue in the present era, because we're in a false disalignment at the present time. A non-productive disalignment, I will say. It's just non-productive. So we want to create a productive humanity. So hopefully people will look at the book, and we can look at some of the books and begin to work with it. And books have a strange life. It's not, you can knock on somebody's door, here's my book. It doesn't work like that, but they just have a way of circulating naturally, across time and space.
Well, we found you from the Cannibal book, which I think is from 2017 or 20, it's not recent. And we just stumbled on an excerpt that you wrote online. So certainly we feel that was synchronistic.
Yeah, that's all I'm looking for. I'm not looking for a fixed audience or fix this or fix that, but the way life influences itself. I don't know if that's a word, but to create this confluent vocabulary of the planet Earth for the human race.
Well, we're kind of coming to the time here, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like to end on, Will, or if you'd like to take us out with a short reading.
Okay, well, let's see what we can do here. I'll read a little bit more from the Congo. And let's say what we can say here. Let's see. And so for the Christian European, suffering equates with holiness, conscripted within the eye by an all-consuming logic. Yet the rashes, the machetes, the scorpion attacks help maintain authority by God. This being an earthsta's divinity at the superimposed juncture between living forms and energy that takes on the form of the after states. This being a false and seismic fulcrum by which labor is spurred amidst dark emotional cataclysms, where the dead announce themselves via seismic threat, always hounding the living. This provokes the mind as barren counterspinning, sans Tao's psychic apogees. This being as hidden roundelay, ignited on the part of our secretive exploiters, being Eurocentric stultification via dark geometrical perjury, understanding that their phantoms are exhausted, that crucial measures of fatigue now evince their power as a priori opacity and stumbling. This replicates site-specific interplayed, mingling with forces of claustrophobic outrage, being charismatic, unsettlement, alive with wavering activation. So as my apprenticeship to being deepens, I broach the invisible via refined degree so that I am parallel and optimum to myself, alchemically harried, yet risen above colonial harassment. If I can leave it there.
Thank you so much, Will. Where can people order your latest books? You have so many publishers.
Oh yeah, it's somewhat of a dilemma, but pick up this one. This has been around, The Combustion Cycle, and that's from Roof Books, and that just came out, I think, this year. And of course, The Refractive Africa, the both versions, and the British version from which I read, and the one that you have there. Also, as I mentioned, the Litmus book is coming out with the coming mental range of essays, and Divine Blue Light is another book of poetry coming out from City Lights in November. So that's, and the on Dario Higma is coming out later in the year, around November too, with Africa World Press, and the Dialogics with Heller Levinson's coming out next month, from later this month, I should say, from a press in Arizona. Who I can't, it's so many, I'm losing track. And so I don't try to keep up with things any longer. I don't even try to even measure myself. I just write, and I mean it. I just really write. So I don't even look at my books after they're done. I let other people look at them so I can go on to something else.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us. We really appreciate it, and you've given us so much to think about, as you always do every time we chat with you. And thank you to our viewers on Twitch, and thank you to our current Patreon supporters. If you're looking for a way to help Yes We Cannibal continue this programming, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. And we'll see you in about 2 weeks with Elizabeth Pavanelli. Thanks so much for joining us, and a huge thank you to you, Will.
Okay, thank you guys for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.